You think you know what loneliness feels like. You think it's an empty house on a Saturday night, a phone that doesn't ring. You think it's just being by yourself. But that's not loneliness. That's just quiet. True loneliness is a physical thing. It's a weight in your chest, a cold spot in your bones that no fire can warm. It's a silence so deep you can hear your own heart breaking over and over again. Elias Vance knew that kind of loneliness. The year was 1876, and out in the high, brutal teeth of the Rocky Mountains, Elias had made loneliness his only neighbor. He was a trapper, but he wasn't really trapping for furs. He was trapping himself, setting the steel jaws of solitude around his own soul to keep the rest of the world out. He had a cabin, small, tight, and perfect. Every log was notched with a precision that bordered on madness. It was his fortress against memory. But memories are ghosts, and they don't care about walls. The ghost of his wife, Abigail, laughed in the way the wind whistled through the pines. The ghost of his son, Caleb, echoed in the crackle of the fire. They'd been taken by a fever, a week apart. One day his world was a warm, noisy home. The next it was a silent, frozen grave. So he ran. He ran until the towns and the people and the pitying looks were just a bad dream behind him. He ran to a place where the grief felt honest, where the jagged peaks looked as broken as he felt. His life was a routine, a ritual to keep him from thinking. Check the lines, skin the catch, tan the hides. The work was hard and mindless, and that's what he wanted. He didn't want to think. He didn't want to feel. The only sound he ever made, the only crack in his perfect, miserable silence, was a hum. It was a river song, Abigail's song, a simple melody she'd sung to Caleb every night about water finding its way home to the sea. He never sang the words were hers. His voice felt like a trespasser, so he just hummed, a ghost of a song from a ghost of a man. And for years it worked. The silence, the mountains, the work. He was numb. He was a machine made of leather and grief. Until one day the routine broke. He was in a box canyon, miles from his cabin, checking a line he'd set for mink, and the air changed. It wasn't just quiet. It was held, like the whole world was holding its breath. Elias was a man who lived by instinct. His instincts were screaming. He moved low and slow, his rifle feeling like a toy in his hands. He peered through a curtain of aspen trees, his eyes scanning the canyon floor. And that's when he saw it. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a mountain lion. It was a camp, a massive encampment of Cheyenne, their lodges set up in a perfect, solemn circle. This wasn't a hunting party. This was something else, something heavy. Smoke rose from a central fire, but there was no life. No kids playing, no dogs barking, just a low, humming murmur that sounded like a prayer and a wound at the same time. His brain, the part of him that still cared about living, told him to leave. Now, a lone white man stumbling into a private tribal ceremony. That was a death sentence, plain and simple. But he couldn't move. His eyes were locked on the center of the camp. There was a platform draped in buffalo robes, and on it a person was lying still, too still. Around the platform, warriors stood like statues, their faces painted in colors he didn't recognize. But he recognized the look in their eyes. He'd seen it in his own mirror every morning. Loss. But then he saw something else, something that made the blood freeze in his veins. To the side of the platform, a young woman was on her knees. Her arms were stretched out, tied to two stakes in the ground. Her head was bowed, her long black hair hiding her face. She was bound, a captive. Alessa's mind, which had been a frozen lake for years, suddenly shattered into 1,000 sharp pieces. He wasn't looking at a funeral. He was looking at a sacrifice. They were going to kill her, for their ritual, for whatever medicine they were trying to make. He should have left. Every single part of him knew it. Run. Disappear back into the trees. It's not your business. It's not your fight. But he saw Abigail, her body surrendering to the fever. He saw Caleb, so small and helpless. He had been powerless to stop death then. He had stood by and done nothing as his world was ripped away. He wasn't going to do nothing now. He didn't have a plan. He just had a rifle and a rage that had been sleeping for years. He thought maybe a warning shot, something to distract them, scare them. Give the girl a chance to run. It was a stupid idea, a suicidal idea. He raised his rifle, the cold metal of familiar weight. He found a spot on the canyon wall, high above the camp. He took a breath. He squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle shot was like the sky splitting open. It ripped through the solemn quiet, echoing off the rock walls, a sound of violence and intrusion. For a split second, the entire camp froze. Every head, every pair of eyes snapped in his direction. But the girl didn't run. She didn't even flinch. And that's when he knew he'd made a terrible, terrible mistake. The silence that followed the gunshot was 100 times worse than before. It was a living, breathing thing, filled with menace. Elias's heart was a drum beating a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He'd expected chaos, shouting, panic. Instead, there was only stillness. And then, one man detached himself from the circle of warriors. He was tall, built like a mountain cat, all lean muscle and coiled power. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes burned with a cold fire that seemed to see right through the trees, right into Elias's soul. This was the leader, there was no doubt. He started walking towards the aspens. Not running, walking. A slow, deliberate, terrifying pace. He moved like a predator that knows its prey is already trapped. Elias's mind was a whirlwind of panic. Run, hide, fight. His hands trembled on his rifle. He could reload. He could try to... What? Shoot him? Shoot them all? It was impossible. He was one man. They were a nation. The warrior kept coming. He didn't have a rifle. He carried only a long, stone-headed club. He didn't need a rifle. His presence was weapon enough. Elias stood his ground. He didn't know why. Maybe it was pride. Maybe he was just too tired to run anymore. He had lived like a ghost for years. Maybe it was time to finally become one. The warrior stepped through the last of the aspens and stopped 10 feet away. His name, though Elias wouldn't learn it for some time, was Hanukkah, and he was the son of the dying chief. Hanukkah's eyes weren't just angry. They were filled with a profound, weary disappointment. He looked at Elias, at his worn buckskins, his gaunt face, the wild fear in his eyes. He glanced at the rifle. Then he looked past Elias, back toward the camp. He said nothing. He just waited. Elias felt a desperate need to explain, to make him understand. His throat was dry. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He just gestured lamely with his rifle towards the camp, towards the bound woman. The girl, he finally rasped, his voice a stranger to his own ears. You can't... Hanukkah's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, confusion, maybe even pity, passed through his eyes. He gave a short, sharp shake of his head. Then he turned slightly and gestured with his chin, inviting Elias to look again. Elias risked a glance, and what he saw made his stomach turn to ice. The woman wasn't a captive. 2 other women were now beside her, carefully, gently, untying the ropes from the stakes. The woman on the ground slowly, painfully, curled her hands into fists. In her palms were 2 dark, smooth stones, covered in something that looked like wet clay. Her hands were red, raw, as if burned. She hadn't been tied down to be killed. She had been tied down to hold on. It was a ritual. She was the medicine woman, and she was holding on to some powerful, dangerous charm, something that was clearly causing her immense pain, all in a desperate attempt to heal the man on the platform. The ropes were to keep her from dropping the stones if she passed out from the agony. Elias felt a wave of shame so powerful it almost buckled his knees. He hadn't been a savior. He had been a fool, an ignorant, arrogant fool who had desecrated their most sacred moment with a blast of gunpowder in misplaced righteousness. He slowly, deliberately, lowered his rifle to his side. It was the only apology he could offer. Hanukkah saw the understanding, the shame, dawn on Elias's face. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. He turned and started walking back to the camp, but then he stopped. He looked back over his shoulder at Elias. He didn't wave him over. He didn't tell him to leave. He just held his gaze for a long moment. The unspoken message was clear. You started this. Now you will see it through. He was being forced to bear witness to the aftermath of his own stupidity. Elias walked out from the trees, his legs feeling like lead. He didn't go into the camp. He found a spot on the edge of the clearing, a place in the shadows where he could watch without intruding any more than he already had. He felt the eyes of the entire tribe on him, a heavy blanket of judgment and suspicion. He sat down, his back against a pine, and prepared for a long, terrible vigil. The sun began to bleed across the sky, painting the clouds in shades of purple and orange. The air grew cold, biting. A low chant started in the camp, a rhythmic, mournful sound that seemed to pull the darkness down from the mountains. Elias watched as the medicine woman, her hands now wrapped in cloth, tended to the old man on the platform. He was the chief. He was the heart of this tribe, and his heart was failing. Elias could see it in the shallow rise and fall of his chest. He could see it in the stoic, cracking facade of Hanukkah, who knelt by his father's side. The night grew deeper. The stars came out, cold and distant, a million unblinking eyes in a black sky. The chief's breaths became ragged, each one a battle, a fight the old warrior was losing. And as he watched, the walls that Elias had built around his own heart began to crumble. He wasn't seeing a stranger die. He was seeing his own life play out again. He saw Hanukkah's desperate hope, and he remembered his own, kneeling by Abigail's bed. He saw the chief's weakening form, and he saw Caleb, his small body surrendering to the fever. The grief he had buried for so long, the grief he had run 1,000 miles to escape, rose up like a flood. It filled his throat, choked him, and empathy so raw and powerful left him breathless. And without thinking, the hum started in his chest. It was quiet at first, just a vibration, but it grew stronger. It rose to his throat, and for the first time in years, the words followed the melody. They came out as a whisper, hoarse from disuse, but clear in the profound stillness of the night. "Oh, the river, it runs to the sea." He sang Abigail's lullaby. He sang it for the dying chief. He sang it for the son who was losing his father. The chanting around the fire faltered. Then it stopped completely. Every single head in the Cheyenne camp turned, their faces illuminated by the firelight, and stared toward the tree line where the strange, soft melody was coming from. Hanukkah looked up, his face a mask of utter shock and bewilderment. Elias should have stopped. He knew he should have. This was another intrusion, another blasphemy. But he couldn't. The song was a river, and he was caught in its current. Through the valley, for you and for me, he sang of a gentle journey, not a painful end. He laid the most sacred, broken piece of his soul bare for these strangers to see. He sang for the chief. He sang for Caleb. He sang for Abigail. He sang until the last note hung in the air like a ghost. In the silence that followed, something impossible happened. The chief's ragged breathing, which had been a terrible, desperate struggle, suddenly eased. His ancient, weathered face, which had been tight with pain, softened. A look of profound peace settled over his features. He took one last, long, gentle breath, and then his eyes, which had been closed for hours, snapped open. They weren't looking at the sky or at his son. They were looking directly into the shadows, directly at Elias. The old chief saw him. A small, faint smile touched his lips, and then he was gone. Voken, the great chief of the Cheyenne, had completed his journey, and the last thing he saw on this earth was the face of the man who had sung him home. The silence in the canyon was absolute. It was the silence of 100 hearts that had just stopped beating. Hanukkah stared from his father's peaceful face to the shadows where Elias was hidden, a look of stunned, terrified awe dawning in his eyes. Elias felt as if he'd been hollowed out. He had given away the last piece of his wife, the last piece of his son. There was nothing left inside him but a cold, echoing emptiness. He didn't wait for their reaction. He didn't wait for their judgment or their gratitude. He simply stood up, turned, and melted back into the forest. He walked through the darkness, stumbling over roots and rocks, his body on autopilot. His mind was a blank slate. He reached his cabin as the first hint of gray dawn touched the sky. He didn't take off his boots. He didn't light a fire. He fell onto his cot fully clothed and was dragged into a sleep so deep it was like a small death. He woke up hours later, not to a sound, but to the lack of it. The usual morning noises, the chatter of squirrels, the cry of a hawk, the rustle of the wind, were gone, replaced by a silence that was thick, heavy, and pressing. It was the silence of 100 held breaths. Elias's heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat of dread. He rose from the cot, his body aching with a weariness that went bone deep. He crept to the single small window, his hands shaking. He pulled back the corner of the worn burlap curtain, and his world stopped. They were here. The entire Cheyenne nation, it seemed, was standing in his clearing, warriors in silent, ordered ranks, their lances and bows held at rest. Behind them the women, the children, the elders. A vast, silent sea of humanity that stretched from his doorstep back into the trees. There must have been 800 people, and every single one of them was staring at his cabin. They weren't painted for war. Their faces were solemn, patient. They weren't surrounding him to attack. They were holding vigil. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog in Elias's mind. This was it. The song. It wasn't a comfort. It was a crime. He had interfered with the spirit's passage. He had stolen their chief's soul with his white man's song, and now they had come for payment. He was trapped, one man against a nation. His rifle was by the door, a useless piece of wood and steel. He was a dead man. The fortress of solitude he had built for himself had been breached, and now the world was flooding in to drown him. He stood at the window, frozen, for what felt like an eternity. The silence outside was a crushing weight. He couldn't run. He couldn't hide. He could only wait. Finally, a single figure detached himself from the front rank and began to walk toward the cabin. It was Hanukkah. He moved with a formal, deliberate grace. He carried no weapon. He stopped 10 feet from the door and simply stood there, his face a study in deep, unreadable emotion. Elias's mind raced. He could stay inside, a coward in a wooden tomb, or he could face his end with whatever dignity he had left. He thought of Abigail, of the courage she'd shown. He would not die cowering in the dark. Taking a deep, ragged breath, he unlatched the door and stepped out into the blinding morning light. Hanaka stood before him. His gaze was direct, intense. It felt like he was looking straight through Elias's skin, weighing his very soul. Elias braced himself for the accusation, for the sentence. Then Hanukkah spoke. He used the few halting English words he knew, supplemented by the elegant, expressive signs of his people. The song, he said, his hand gesturing first to the sky, the spirit world, and then to his own heart. For my father. He pointed back towards their distant camp. He traveled, on the song. His hands made a motion like a smoothly flowing river. His spirit has peace. Elias stared, his mind struggling to catch up. This wasn't an execution. This wasn't vengeance. This was something else entirely. Hanukkah took a step closer. His eyes were no longer hard. They were pleading. The spirit song, he said, his voice low and urgent. It is good medicine, strong medicine. He gestured to the silent, waiting nation behind him. My people, we must know the words. We must learn the song. For Voken, and for all who will travel after him. He looked directly into Elias's eyes, the unspoken question hanging between them, heavier and more terrifying than any threat. You will teach us. The request hit Elias like a physical blow. It was an invasion far more profound than any attack. They wanted the song, his song, the last pure piece of Abigail and Caleb he had left in the world. It was the hymn of his private church of sorrow, and they wanted him to nail it to the door for everyone to read. To teach it would mean singing it again, and again, and again, feeling the sharp edge of its grief with every note, every word, until it was no longer his. It would be like digging up his wife and son and showing their bones to the world. He looked past Hanukkah at the hundreds of faces watching him. He saw warriors, their eyes raw with fresh grief. He saw mothers clutching their children. He saw old men whose faces were maps of a long life, now contemplating their own final journey. He didn't see a threat. He saw a people drowning in the same ocean of loss that he had been adrift in for years. He had a choice: the cold, dead safety of his past, or the terrifying, vibrant possibility of a shared present. to hoard his grief or to share its only comfort. Elias Vance took a long, shuddering breath. He looked at Honaka, and he gave a slow, deliberate nod. A quiet sigh, a collective exhalation of relief, passed through the assembled tribe. Elias cleared his throat, which felt tight with unshed tears. He stood straight before the 800 waiting souls, and he began. "Oh, the river," he sang, his voice trembling at first. "It runs to the sea." He paused, motioning with his hand. After a moment, a few hesitant voices tried to mimic the sounds. Honaka's rich baritone joined in, strong and clear. Soon a chorus of voices, awkward and uncertain, rose to repeat the phrase. For 3 days the mountain was a school. Elias taught them, line by line, word by word. He walked among them, correcting pronunciation, his initial terror replaced by a profound, surreal sense of purpose. He shared his meager rations. They brought him roasted venison. He learned Hanukkah's name, and they learned his. They didn't have a common language. They had the song. On the morning of the 4th day, they were ready. The entire tribe stood facing the rising sun, and as one, they began to sing. 800 voices singing Abigail's lullaby to the mountains. A final, powerful farewell to their chief. Elias stood apart, listening, and he felt the tight, cold knot of his own grief begin to dissolve. Not vanishing, but loosening, its bitter concentration diluted in that great chorus of shared humanity. When it was over, a peaceful silence settled on the valley. The Cheyenne began to break camp. Honaka approached him one last time, placing a magnificent painted buffalo robe over his shoulders. "Elias Vance," Honaka said, the name sounding strange and important. "Your song is now our song. You are not forgotten." And then they were gone. Elias returned to his cabin. The silence that greeted him was different now. It was not empty. It was filled with the echo of 800 voices. But the story doesn't end there, because there was one problem. The magic wasn't real. Weeks turned into a month. The painted robe was a constant warm presence in his small cabin. Elias found himself humming the river song, not with pain, but with a strange sense of peace. He had shared his burden, and somehow it had become lighter. He was still alone, but he was no longer lonely. He thought the story was over. He was wrong. It was late afternoon when he saw the rider, a single warrior, pushing his horse hard, coming from the direction the Cheyenne had gone. Elias's heart lurched. He recognized the horse. It was Honaka's. Honaka slid from his lathered pony, his face grim. The look of peace and gratitude was gone, replaced by a deep, troubled anxiety. "Elias Vance," he said, his voice strained. "You must come. What is it? What's wrong?" "It is the song," Honaka said, his eyes dark with worry. "It does not work." Elias didn't understand. "What do you mean it doesn't work? It's a song." "Another has begun the journey," Honaka explained. "An elder woman beloved by the tribe was dying. We sang for her, as you taught us. We sang with one voice." He looked at Elias, his expression lost and confused. "But her spirit finds no peace. She fights. She suffers. The song, it has no medicine for her." The blood drained from Elias's face. Of course it didn't work. It was a lullaby, a simple tune of love and loss. The peace it had brought Vulcan was a coincidence, a fluke of timing, a beautiful, impossible accident. They didn't see an accident. They saw a miracle. And now he was the miracle worker whose miracle had failed. "The people are afraid," Honaka said, lowering his voice. "They whisper. They say the spirit of the song was for my father only. Others, others say the white man did not teach us the true song, that you kept the magic for yourself." Elias felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He knew what this meant. In their world of spirits and signs, a failed miracle wasn't just a disappointment, it was a bad omen, a betrayal. "There was a warrior," Hanukkah explained, named Stone Fist. He had been Vulcan's rival for years, a man who believed the old ways were weak and that the tribe should meet the white man's world with aggression, not peace. Stone Fist had been quiet since Vulcan's death, but now he was speaking up. "He says you are a trickster," Hanukkah said. "He says I have been fooled by a paleface's lies. He tells the people the song's failure is a sign, a sign that I am not fit to lead. The stakes were suddenly immense. This wasn't just about a song anymore. It was about Honaka's leadership, the stability of the entire tribe, and Elias was standing right in the middle of it. You must come, Honaka repeated. You must sing the song for her. You must show them the medicine is real. Elias's throat went dry. Honaka, the song has no medicine. It's just words. It was my wife's song. Hanaka's eyes hardened slightly. For my father, it was medicine. I saw it. We all saw it. His spirit was trapped, and your song set it free. He didn't understand coincidence. He understood power, and he believed Elias had a power he was now withholding. Elias knew he had no choice. To refuse would be to admit he was a fraud and condemn Honaka. He had to go. He had to stand before a dying woman and a suspicious tribe and pretend to be a magician. The journey to the new Cheyenne camp was a blur of frantic riding and silent dread. When they arrived, the atmosphere was completely different from the morning camp he'd first seen. The air was thick with tension, suspicion, and fear. Warriors stood in tight knots, whispering, their gazes hostile as Elias passed. He saw Stone Fist, a broad, powerful man with eyes like chips of obsidian, watching him with open contempt. The dying elder was in her lodge. Her family gathered around her. She was struggling, just as Honoka had said, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. Her eyes were wide with fear, not peace. Honoka gestured for Elias to begin. Elias knelt. The entire family, the entire tribe it seemed, was crowded around, watching, waiting. He took a breath. He looked at the old woman's frightened face, and he sang, "Oh, the river, it runs to the sea." His voice was clear. The melody was pure, but the words felt hollow. They were a lie. He was a fraud, performing a cheap parlor trick for a dying woman. He sang the entire song. And when the last note faded, nothing had changed. The woman still struggled. The fear did not leave her eyes. The peace did not come. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Stone Fist stepped forward, his face a mask of triumph. "His magic is gone," he declared, his voice booming. "Or he refuses to use it for us. The spirits are angry. They have shown us the truth. The white man is a liar, and Honaka is a fool for trusting him." The crowd shifted, their fear turning to anger. Honaka stood his ground, his hand on the knife at his belt, but he was outnumbered. His authority was crumbling. "You will prove your magic," Stone Fist snarled at Elias, "or you will pay the price for your deception." He pointed to another figure in the crowd, a young boy, pale and shivering with fever. "This boy is sick. Heal him with your medicine, or by sunrise my warriors will give your spirit to the wind." Elias was trapped. He'd been given an impossible ultimatum. He couldn't heal the boy. The song was just a song. He was going to die. As they dragged him to a lodge to be held for the night, a small cloaked figure slipped through the crowd and pressed something into his hand. It was a small leather pouch. He looked up and saw the face of the medicine woman, the one who had been tied to the stakes. Her name was Willow Leaf. Her eyes were filled with an urgent intelligence. She gave him a tiny, almost imperceptible nod before melting back into the shadows. Elias was thrown into an empty lodge, the flap guarded by two of Stone Fist's largest warriors. His mind was racing. He was a dead man. There was no way out. He opened the small pouch Willow Leaf had given him. Inside were dried herbs and a small, smooth, dark stone. It was one of the stones she had been holding during the ritual. But why give it to him? Then he smelled it. A faint, bitter, almond-like scent coming from the herbs. Elias was a trapper. He knew plants. He knew poisons. He had used plants with a similar scent to bait traps for small animals. It was a nerve toxin, subtle, slow-acting. His blood ran cold. He scrambled back in his memory, back to that first day. The dying chief, Voken, the struggling elder, the sick boy. Their symptoms weren't all the same. The boy just had a fever. But the two elders, their breathing, their struggle. It wasn't just old age. It was something else. He looked at the stone. He looked at the herbs. And a terrible, unbelievable thought began to form in his mind. The song had never been the medicine. The song was a distraction. The real event, the thing that had brought Voken peace, wasn't the song. It was the poison. Willow Leaf hadn't been performing a ritual to save the chief. She had been performing a mercy killing. The stones weren't a charm. They were a delivery system for a poison that would ease a painful, inevitable death. His song had simply coincided with the moment the poison finally worked. But if that were true, why was the other elder still suffering? Why hadn't Willow Leaf helped her too? Unless she couldn't. Unless someone was stopping her. Someone who wanted the elder to suffer. Someone who wanted the song to fail. Someone who wanted to create chaos and discredit Hanukkah. Stone Fist. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Stone Fist had seen the coincidence of Elias's song and Vokin's peaceful death. He saw how it elevated Hanukkah, who embraced this new magic. So he created a situation where the magic was sure to fail. He used the dying elder as a pawn, ensuring Willow Leaf couldn't get near her to administer the poison of mercy. He created a public test, knowing Elias would fail, allowing him to seize power in the ensuing chaos. But then another darker thought struck him. What if Vokin's death wasn't from old age at all? What if it was just the first step in Stonefist's plan? Elias had to get a message to Honaka. But how? He was a prisoner. He looked at the herbs again. An idea sparked. A desperate, dangerous idea. He took a small pinch of the crushed leaves, and when the guard brought him a bowl of water, he let them dissolve. He waited an hour, his heart pounding. Then he began to cough. At first it was small, then it grew more violent. He clutched his chest, gasping for air, mimicking the symptoms he'd seen. He let himself fall to the ground, convulsing. The guards, alarmed, called for Honaka. When Hanukkah entered the lodge, he saw Elias on the floor, seemingly struggling for breath. Stone Fist! Poisoned the water! Elias gasped, his voice a choked whisper. Hanukkah's eyes went wide. He knelt down. Quickly, Elias whispered, his voice now normal. It's a trick. I'm not poisoned, but you and I are in danger. In low, urgent tones, he explained everything. The poison, Willow Leaf's mercy killing, his suspicion that Stone Fist had orchestrated the entire crisis, and the even more terrible suspicion that Stone Fist might have poisoned Vokin in the first place. Hanukkah listened, his face a storm of emotions. Disbelief, then anger, then a cold, hard resolve. He was a leader, and he had been played. Willow Leaf, Hanukkah said. She would not lie about this. Get her, Elias urged, but be careful. Stone Fist is watching you. Hanukkah stood up, his face a mask of grief for the guards to see. He is dying, he announced. The white man's spirit is weak. He left the lodge, and Elias was alone again, his fate now in Hanukkah's hands. Hours passed. The sun began to set. Elias's time was running out. Just as despair began to set in, the lodge flap was thrown open. It wasn't Hanukkah. It was Stone Fist and two of his warriors. The sun is down, Stone Fist sneered. The boy is not healed. Your time is over, trickster. They dragged him from the lodge and into the center of the camp. The entire tribe was gathered. The sick boy was there, looking slightly better. His fever had broken on its own. But it didn't matter. The crowd was tense, angry, their fears stoked by Stone Fist's words. They tied Elias to a post. Stone Fist stood before him, a war club in his hand. This liar came to us with a sweet song and a forked tongue, Stone Fist bellowed to the crowd. He poisoned our minds and shamed our traditions. He promised magic, but delivered only failure. This is a sign that we must turn from these new, weak ways. Hanukkah offered you a white man's song. I offer you a warrior's strength. He raised the club. Elias closed his eyes. Stop! The voice belonged to Hanukkah. He strode into the firelight, Willow Leaf at his side. He looked calm, powerful. He was a chief again. You are right, Stone Fist, Hanukkah said, his voice ringing with authority. There was a poisoner in our midst, but it was not this man. Stone Fist laughed. You defend him still? He has bewitched you. No, Hanukkah replied, his voice deadly quiet. He has opened my eyes. He turned to Willow Leaf. Tell them. Willow Leaf stepped forward. Her voice was soft, but it carried in the tense silence. She told them about the tradition of the River of Sleep, a mercy given only by the medicine woman to those whose suffering could not be ended, a poison to grant a peaceful journey. She confessed she had given it to Vulcan to ease his final moments. Then she looked at Stone Fist. But when the elder woman was dying, your warriors barred me from her lodge. They said you commanded that only the white man's song be used to help her. You ensured she would suffer. You ensured the song would fail. A murmur of shock went through the crowd. Stone Fist's face contorted in rage. Lies! A woman's feeble lies to protect her chief's pet. Is it a lie? Hanukkah challenged, taking a step forward. My father was old, but he was strong. His sickness came upon him quickly, after the traders from the fort visited. After you were the one to accept their gifts of blankets and flour for him. The crowd gasped. The implication was clear. And when I went to the place where you stored the flour, Honaka continued, his voice like thunder, I found this. He held up a small, empty leather pouch, identical to the one Willow Leaf used. You stole her poison. You didn't just let my father die. You murdered him. The truth was out, vicious, horrifying, complete. Stone Fist hadn't just created a political crisis. He had committed patricide against the tribe. He had murdered their chief to seize power. Stone Fist was trapped, exposed. With a roar of pure fury, he did the only thing a cornered animal could do. He lunged, not at Honaka, at Elias. He swung his war club, a vicious killing blow. But Honaka was faster. He moved like lightning, his knife already in his hand. He didn't block the club. He stepped inside the swing. A brutally efficient motion. There was a sickening thud, and Stone Fist grunted, his eyes wide with shock. He looked down. Honaka's knife was buried to the hilt in his chest. Stone Fist staggered back, the war club falling from his grasp. He collapsed to the ground, his treacherous reign over before it had even begun. Justice had been served. Swift, brutal, final. In the stunned silence that followed, Hanukkah turned to face his people. He looked at Elias, still tied to the post, and with his own knife he cut the ropes. He turned back to the tribe. We have been blinded by fear and ambition, he said, his voice filled with sorrow and strength. We looked for magic when we should have looked for truth. This man, Elias Vance, did not bring us a magic cure. He brought us something far more important, a song of peace, a gift of the heart. We twisted that gift into a weapon. The shame is ours. He walked to Elias, the bloody knife still in his hand. He wiped it clean on the grass and offered it to Elias, hilt first. It was a sign of ultimate trust, an apology. Elias took it. The next morning, the tribe broke camp. The mood was somber, but the thick tension was gone, replaced by a renewed sense of unity under their rightful chief. Hanukkah approached Elias one last time. The song, Hanukkah said, we understand its meaning now, not of magic, but of passage, of memory. It will be the farewell song for our people, as we intended. But we will sing it with true hearts now. He placed the magnificent painted buffalo robe, the one they had given him before, back over Elias's shoulders. It felt heavier this time, weighted with truth and blood. Elias Vance, Honaka said, your song helped us find justice. Your courage helped us find our way. You are no longer an outsider. You are a friend to the Cheyenne. And with that, they left. Elias returned to his cabin. The silence that greeted him was different yet again. It was not empty. It was not an echo. It was clean. The ghosts of his past felt distant, quiet. The trauma of the last few days had, in a strange way, scoured his soul clean. He was no longer just a man running from his grief. He was a man who had walked through the fire of another people's pain and had come out the other side. He had stumbled into their lives by accident, caused chaos through ignorance, and in the end, helped them find a terrible truth. And they, in turn, had helped him find something he thought he'd lost forever, a reason to keep living. Months later, as the first snows of winter began to fall, Elias stood outside his door, the painted robe wrapped around him. The wind whistled through the pines, and for a moment, he thought he could hear a faint, distant melody carried on the breeze. He smiled, and he began to sing the river song. The words were still his. They were still Abigail's. But now they belonged to the mountains, too. His grief was no longer a weight. It was a song, and he had finally, truly learned how to let it fly. If you enjoyed this story of survival, justice, and the strange ways we find connection, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You never know what secrets are waiting to be uncovered in the wild places of the world.